Namaskar to everyone. I am Ayush speaking on behalf of Voices from the Periphery, and it's both a privilege and an honor to welcome each one of you to today's much anticipated lecture between the raw and the cooked, new tools, capacities, and approaches for the oral history teacher. This occasion holds deep significance for all of us as we are graced by the presence of one of the most distinguished and influential voices in the field of contemporary world study, Professor Michael Frisch. Professor Frisch is a renowned American historian, a devoted public scholar, and a pioneering figure in the field of oral history and public humanities. He is Professor Emeritus of History and American Studies at the University at Buffalo, State University of New York. Over the years, he has emerged as a towering presence in the world of community engaged scholarship, memory studies, and the democratization of history making processes. His seminal work, A Shared Authority Essays on the Craft and Meaning of Oral and Public History 1990, has had a transformative impact on the discipline. In this deeply influential volume, Professor Frisch introduced and developed the concept of shared authority, a notion that profoundly reshaped how we understand the practice of oral history. It called for a collaborative model where communities and scholars together become co-creators of knowledge, challenging of traditional hierarchies and opening new, inclusive possibilities for participatory historical work. But Dr. Frisch's contribution go far beyond the theoretical. He has actively engaged in reading history and technology and public life. His work with Brantford Associates, which he founded, brought oral history into new institutional and community contexts through innovative digital tools, methodologies, expanding both access and impact. His approach has influenced museum practices, cultural memory projects, and digital humanities worldwide. He has also served in leadership roles, key academic organizations, including the Oral History Association, and has guided and mentored generations of scholars who now carry forward the ethos of ethical, collaborative, and community-rooted historical work. Today, as we gather here, we are not only fortunate but truly humbled to welcome Professor Michael Frisch and his intellectual generosity and lifelong commitment to public scholarship continue to inspire us to reimagine how histories are created, shared, and honored in service of justice, memory, and humanity. Let us welcome with warmth and gratitude, sir.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I don't quite recognize the person that you're talking about, but I'm very humbled to be associated with that. So it's really a delight to really meet your group virtually. I've been in India several times, particularly in Bangalore for the International Oral History Association, and then I was back to work with Venkat Srinivasan and Indira Chowdhury, who were really leading oral history work in Bangalore. So, and I hope at some point to return. So, what I will really try to telescope in these remarks today is really essentially a journey that's taken me from the work that I did in a shared authority a while back, which was really mostly focused on understanding the interview itself in oral history as a dialogue, along with people like Sandro Portelli in Italy and Luisa Passerini and others in Europe and in Italy and really other places. Many of us, I think, were converging on this idea that oral history is not an extraction of stories or knowledge in a sort of passive way. It's essentially based on a fundamental dialogue in which both sides generate, literally co-create, but even more, both sides have to really be listening to each other and learning from each other and finding what they have to say to each other in the form of an interview. And in effect, I think what's happened in the work that we've been doing as consultants on many, many projects around the world is discovering that same dialogic dimension is true in working with oral history, in processing it, in editing it, in all the forms in which we try to find meaning that can be shared with the communities that matter to us in our work. And that's mostly what I'll be introducing today in some very new forms that have transformed a lot of our practice just in the last couple of years. So it's really a window into the 21st century, capacities opening up in oral history, that's grounded in what many of us have been talking about in terms of shared authority and dialogue for quite a while. So very briefly, if you could pull up number D, and share that for a second. People could look at that briefly. If you can read it, that's and we have copies of all. Oh, great! That's a précis of what I'll be covering here. So you can look at that while I'm doing the introductory remarks. When we began our work in essentially collection management as consultants, working with a variety of institutions who had stuff, they had collections. The question is, how can we share this? How can we use it? How can we really apply it to our work? In doing that, we discovered that we worked initially with it. We were working mostly with large collections and with whole interviews. And we worked with an early form of software, which is unfortunately now obsolete, but they're trying to reinvent it for the cloud. But it was the interesting thing about it, it was a platform called Interclipper that allowed you to index and to mark up the actual audio or video recording without requiring transcripts. So you would mark out a passage of a time and attach metadata to it and so forth. And the interesting thing that we were led to on the platform that Interclipper provided was the idea, it's a very simple idea in social science, that as opposed to the usual process of throwing keywords in a kind of random way at collections, which is really what most indexing does. They just list long keywords and you can find the keyword and it will bring you to those parts of an interview that talk about X, Y, or Z. And we found the software we were using opened up the idea of creating a coding framework in different variable fields, each of which could have its own taxonomy. So the very simple way we had to talk about this, we called, you'll pardon the reference, we called it the Chinese vegetable spicy approach, CVS, Chinese vegetable and spicy. And the idea very simply was everybody would recognize if you had a database of 10,000 recipes, if you had such a database, and if somebody said, is that recipe Chinese or vegetable? Or is it spicy? And you would say, well, that's a meaningless question. That one is Chinese and spicy and vegetable. That one is Chinese and pork and not spicy. That one is Indian and spicy and vegetable, and so forth. So you needed a different set of terms for each field, and then Interclipper was wonderful in allowing you to go back and forth in terms of which was the independent and which was the dependent variable. So in oral history terms, for example, if you had a collection of interviews, they might be, field one might be military, business, community action, and so forth. Field two might be leadership, training, racism, social conflict. Field three might be personal anecdote, long narrative, and so forth. And you could really sort them any way. So you could say, I want leadership, whether it's in business or industry or community development, and I want ones that are humorous and some that are poignant and some that are inspiring and so forth. Or you could say, I want a humorous story. I don't care what it's about. It could be about anything. So you could move around in it. So we did a lot of that in our work with projects to helping them get control of their material and without using transcripts. So that we did that for about 8 or 10 years on some very large projects around the country and some of them internationally. And it was very, very helpful, although the software ended up not really, it never made it to the cloud, so it was somewhat limited and so forth. What's happened in the last couple of years is that there are new tools that have emerged in a variety of ways, both AI and not so AI, that have transformed what's possible. And for this, let's see if we could bring up number A, share that screen. And that's the one, if you could have the full PDF, that would be great. Right, good. This, again, you'll be able to get copies of this. This was our handout at the oral history meeting in 2024. And it kind of sums up the two things I'd like to point out here. I'll talk about the top one in the main body of my presentation. But one thing which we don't have time to go into today, but I will mention at the bottom, I was a partner with some other people in developing an app called Pixtory, Pixstory. It's now available under, as you see on there, pixtoryplus.com. It's free, you can play with it and so forth. And what it is simply a way to combine in a social media environment a photograph and the stories that are prompted by it. So either you can put up photographs and ask people to story them, or you can have people upload their own photographs or their own portraits and selfies and introduce themselves. It puts together a still photograph and an audio component. And the relationship between these is really potentially very powerful. And the additional thing in Pixtory, which I'll invite you to explore sometime, is that it's a social media environment, which means that you can have a gallery of Pixtories, these photo and voice story combinations, and people can add their own comments in their own voice, and so you end up with a living conversation thread. This has enormous community implications, perhaps for groups like yours in your practice, and we'd be delighted to help you explore getting some of that. It's very flexible in how it's used and deployed. The basic operation is free, and it's on the web, and we'll talk about that more perhaps in follow-up to it. But what I'd like to focus on in most of this talk is the work that's happened very, very recently that just involves a new approach to working with transcripts. It's made possible by the fact, as many of you know, that with voice-to-text AI, you can now push a button and get a transcript instantly. It's not a final, it needs a lot of refinement, but it eliminates the enormous burden of expense and labor involved in producing manual transcripts or even word process transcripts. So it cuts out all of that and opens up a path to really doing remarkable things with it. So I'd like to focus on that. That's what we've been transformed in recent years, and the basic metaphor that I've been using for this, and I have a number that I'll unfold here for you, is essentially, and it's more and more my sense of the field here in the US and in many cases internationally as well, perhaps to some extent in India from my windows into Indira's work and Venkat's work in Bangalore, that by and large, oral history has been stuck between the raw and the cooked. The raw meaning collections and how they're managed. We have in archives, essentially, usually, or other holding institutions. You end up with large collections of long interviews. Perhaps they have some mapping that allows you, and keywords that allows you to look for some things in it. But essentially, it's based on the whole interview in its transcribed form. And at the other end, you have output, you have an exhibit, you have a research piece, you have a documentary film in which somebody has come in and found something, pulled it out, edited it, um, consolidated it, and shaped it into a public or a shareable presentation. So that's the raw and the cooked. And the simple metaphor is between, as you saw in the overview, between the raw and the cooked is the kitchen. That's where the raw gets cooked. And if it's a well-organized kitchen, if it's if you can find things, if it has what's needed, and particularly if it's in a restaurant, if it's a kitchen that has a menu that it's prepared to deliver to people who order, who need this, that, or something else, then it can be, if it's legible, if the process is clear, then it's open to more community participation in the process of cooking. It's not simply something in the back end for the experts or the scholars or that. And so most of our work now is really focused on the kitchen, on what you can do with oral histories and so forth. And that leads to essentially what we've discovered in working with, for us, a new form, working with transcripts almost exclusively that are connected to the media by time codes. So even that distinction, you read a transcript, you push a button, and it plays that part of the interview. It means you have the orality and you have the capacity to read more flexibly brought together. So it's really been a remarkable journey, and we'll walk through some of it now. So if we could look at poster A.
Pardon, sir, which slide?
It was, I'm sorry, poster B, I'm sorry.
Poster B, okay.
So this was the first one. And how do you get from there to here? On the left, you see essentially a raw auto transcription. And on the right, you see two versions, which is the journey that we'll get to in a few minutes, of a compact story that comes out of the broad transcript, in this case about Martin Luther King. And at the bottom, we have an actual clip, which is marked with the time code of beginning and end so that you could pull out that section for multimedia use. So the question is, how do you get from the raw transcript, which again, you push a button and voice to text, you have, through the magic of AI, you have a pretty good automatic transcription, and how do you get to this usable material? So if we could go to the next one, which would be poster A. I'm sorry, poster C. Right. So this is the process that we found ourselves initially on this remarkable oral history project of a community, a Black community in New Orleans, an early post-war community at the end of segregation and the opening of an integrated world that was populated by a rising Black middle class and labor union class of people who really found the opportunity to have their own community within an integrating city within the city of New Orleans. So that's the first project we had a chance to experiment with. And if you walk around the circle, you'll see the dimensions that we could go through. We start with a raw auto transcript, which you looked at before, or what we're now calling an AI transcript. We then produce a more consolidated version. I'll illustrate all these in a second, which is organized in paragraphs, usually 2 or 3 minutes long, with a time code so that you can always get to the vicinity. We end up with a table of contents that is, in a way, a map of the entire interview. And then probably the most useful and important part, we then do some edits, or we work with people to do edits, where they divide it into chapters or units, often 10 minutes, 15 minutes long, and then squeeze out the water, so to speak, and produce a a digest, a condensed form of that, and yet it's all still in the voice of the person being interviewed and the interviewer, so that it's still a verbatim transcript. It's just edited down so that it becomes more compact and usable. And then we found it was easy to just keep going as you follow around the circle. We then looked at that unit digest and said, what are three or four, or we asked people at the projects to identify three or four highlight stories or moments or discussions within that. And then those could be brought out as their own digest within the unit. So they're often 100 words, 150 words, and so forth. And then the final version is to go back to the transcript and get the clip for the actual extractable audio or video media that you could use in a multimedia production. So this is the thing we'll look through. And if we could now sort of look at, we'll go through the numbered ones, my friends. So if we could look at number one, the AI transcript uncorrected. That's poster one. Okay, now this, again, these are all just for, no, not that. No,
So this one or number one?
number one.
Oh, number one. Okay.
Right. So this is what the raw transcript looks like, and it's remarkable. I mean, the thing that's so remarkable about the instant transcripts is that in order to do them, the way it works in most cases that I've seen is that every time there's a speaker change, it's a new paragraph with a new time code. And this means that you end up with very extensive transcripts that go on for 100 pages for an hour or an hour and 10 minutes or an hour or 15 minutes, particularly if they're conversational, because as you can see on the bottom of the left there, every time there's a speaker change, they're going back and forth, it becomes a new paragraph. And often they have trouble identifying the speakers, which was the case in this interview, and there are some other mistranscriptions. But by and large, it's pretty good. And I don't have it on the illustration here because it was part of our practice that evolved later. We now do a separate iteration, which is a corrected AI transcript. So we can make sure all the speakers are correct. We get that into the interactive Their Story platform, which is I'll mention a bit later, that we're using, that allows us to connect the transcript and the recording directly. And so we end up with a transcript which is pretty much what AI has produced, but with the obvious corrections needed in terms of speaker IDs and occasional mistranscriptions. So if we could then go to number two. So this, you can just get a sense visually, and I'll mention once more that all of these PDFs are available on request. So you can really put them side by side and look at the process in detail and figure out what might be something that could be perhaps of interest in your own work in India and elsewhere. So here you can see we've got the conversation back and forth within a paragraph that is usually a minute, 2 minutes, sometimes 3 minutes long. And it makes it much more readable as a conversation, as a back and forth between the interviewer and the person being interviewed. And the paragraph breaks require somebody to make a judgment about when there's enough of a shift to suggest the value of breaking it out as a separate paragraph. So this ends up being 880 words this is just one section of a long interview with a woman named Sybil Morial, who is the widow, actually, of the very first Black mayor of New Orleans. She and her husband, whose name was Dutch Morial, ended up among the first homeowners in this pioneer, this Pontchartrain Park neighborhood in which they were the pioneers in the early 1950s. So if we could go on to number 3. So we then work with them, and this is all their judgments. We're not doing it. And they would essentially divide it into units. And as you can see, like a table of contents, it's a map of the interview. So even just from the titles, you can go down and get a sense of what's there, what's covered, where does it begin, where does it go. It's if you've ever worked much with oral history, the value of something as simple as this, so you have some sense of what's the scope of this interview, is enormous. And in this case, it's grounded pretty much in the transcript itself and its connection to the recording. And as I note in the parentheses under the name, the projects we're now mostly doing, because people want to do it, is they are adding a brief summary in their own words. So somebody steps back and says, teaching marriage and coming to Pontchartrain Park, and they have 2 or 3 sentences saying what's in that section of the interview, which is, in that case, 9 or 10 minutes. It looks like 9 minutes long, 7 minutes long, and they really will give us a nice summary of that. So you end up on one page with really an annotated table of contents, which has enormous value for anybody using a collection or anybody wanting to do something with it. So if we could go on to number 4. So this is an example of the digest, just of this one section that you'll be able to look at more. It turns out to be 50%, a little more, of the original transcript. It's all there. And it's all her words. It's all publishable. And I did a whole book of steelworker interviews, and I had thousands of pages of transcripts, and I published long interviews, 20 pages. But they had to be edited. Somebody was making a judgment, in this case me, in your case it would be often a dialogic process with the community that people agree on what's important and what's not important. But the idea is that you can get a really particular section in a readable form that in 6 or 8 pages would give you what in the transcript originally might have been 80 pages or 100 pages. And yet they said it, it's theirs, it's responsible, it's publishable, it's their words. Okay, if we could go on to number 5. So this is a story digest. And again, you'll look at all this more closely. There are 2 here taken out of that 800 words originally. One of them's 191 words. Well, they're both about 200 words. And they're the essence. And when this was done, among the applications of this, we find most people start with these. They want to see the highlights, and then they dig down from there. In this case, these stories went right into the schools because, a student even in the lower grades, in even elementary school, or what we would call junior high school or high school, can read 191 words and have a discussion about this woman's relationship to Martin Luther King, which is a window into the larger role of her family and political culture in New Orleans and lots of things. So each of these units become usable in many ways for different purposes and for different audiences. And the ability to have all of them there, the stuff that kind of sneaks up on you in this, is that in this 21st century form, each of these, we call them iterations or views, they're all a view of the same thing. And more importantly, they're all connected by time codes to the original media. And C, they are essentially all preserved so you can go from one to the other at a particular point, meaning you can drill up or drill down and see what's there. I compare that to what in most archives has been the state of the art, which is a lot of keywords. And we had one person in New Orleans, a law professor, who was working with this collection, and we had something in the US called the GI Bill, which paid for veterans after World War II, would allow them essentially to be supported in buying homes, the GI Bill. And he was interested in researching how these Black people in New Orleans actually afforded these homes, which were, suburban style homes. They were reasonably substantial. It was a real breakthrough in housing. How did they do it? Some of them had the GI Bill with support because they were veterans. Others of them had networks of knowing a Black banker who could help them with a mortgage and so forth. So he wanted to research that. And what he reported was, traditionally, if it had been a keyworded transcript and he had the keyword GI Bill, that would have taken him to every place in the interview where somebody talked about the GI Bill, usually in relationship to their purchase of the housing. But he said, and I was very impressed with this, he said, it would have been like the keyword would take me to a tree in the middle of a forest, put me at the foot of the tree, and I have no idea where I am, how they got here, how I got here. It would be a tree labeled GI Bill, and I'd have to figure everything out from there. What he found was having these different levels of the workup meant that he could move around and move in and out and then decide what he wanted to drill down deeper into the material, and ended up doing a lot of research in the transcriptive record. And in some cases, back to the original AI transcript to make sure that there was something that had not been missed in producing the transcriptive record. But it was indispensable that he had all these other versions to orient him in the material. So to me, that led to a sense that this kind of approach offers a lot of utility to everybody if the stuff is, in a way, mapped in all of these different dimensions, if they're all connectable, and if they are all preserved. So you're not editing out, moving from one thing to the other and only facing the results of the editing. And I did a presentation last summer talking about some of these same ideas. And in the discussion, I found this very helpful. It's one of the reasons it's great doing discussions with people with your group, and we'll get to some Q&A in a few seconds. And somebody in the discussion it really has transformed my thinking enormously. She said, when I was going through exactly what I've been unfolding for you, she said, well, everybody knows what you're talking about on their phone. I said, what do you mean? She said, GPS. There's one map. And yet we can scroll in, we can scroll out, we can look at that map as a street map of, Bangalore. We can scroll out and we get all of the province you can get whatever you want. Everybody is familiar with this. That's how we work with GPS and maps on our smartphones. And she said, this is doing the same thing for transcripts. And the more official term we use sometimes is to think of transcripts as curatable. This is a way to curate transcripts, meaning you can create different versions of the transcript, like that street map versus the regional map versus the Eastern United States, whatever, that each have a purpose, that each have uses, that each have applications, that each connect to particular needs and audiences, and they're all connected, they're all preserved, they're all accessible. And they're all connected to the media, so at any point you can press the button and hear the voice of the person who's recorded. So, and you can take that out once you found it and use it in a multimedia form. So to me, it's transformed a lot of our work. I don't think anybody is really quite doing it. I like to think sometimes, if you're familiar with the concept of a paradigm shift, meaning a change in thinking, the famous book that you may know by Thomas Kuhn, an American historian of science, who was talking about Galileo and Copernicus and the long process by which people finally came to understand that the planets move around the sun rather than what they would assume looking at the sky, that the sun is moving around the earth. And his point in the paradigm shift notion was that the real innovation, the real revolution in science, as he said, is not the discovery, it's not the technology, it's not the innovation, it's the lag, and finally the catching up of thinking to what the new technology has made. In his case, telescopes had made possible. So that's in oral history. It seems to me that we're still, with all due, I mean, I love working in archives. I've worked in them for a long time. I've done editing for them, but we're still generally stuck with the paradigm of the raw or the cooked. We have huge collections, and somebody then makes an exhibit, or somebody makes a documentary film, or somebody does a research piece, and they find some stuff and they use it. And I really think that for community work, especially, and for what I understand about the Voices from the Periphery network, which is very much connected to the communities that you really want to engage and work together with in a dialogue way. To me, that's where we're really headed, and the newer approaches open up all that's possible. The final metaphor, I'll close with this, is that if you've ever worked in a restaurant, I have, you know that a restaurant has a menu. There are lots of things that it produces, from appetizers to main courses to desserts in our restaurants and your versions in India and elsewhere. And the kitchen that's cooking for that restaurant has got to be ready to make what is needed when it's ordered. And to do that, they don't start from scratch. They have a lot that's prepared. And a lot of the markup that I've been illustrating in these things, and I really encourage you to get the PDFs through the network and really spend some time putting them side by side and looking at them. And I think more than anything I could say, they'll make the point that they all have uses, they all have value, and they're really, really different from each other. And the metaphor that then comes to mind back to the restaurant kitchen is that how does all that stuff get ready to be quickly turned into a dish that's brought out? Well, you need what is generally called a sous chef, or a whole group of them, who are doing the preparations, who are making the sauces, who are making the basis for the salad, who are chopping some vegetables, who are marinating the meat, who are doing all the things so that when the order comes in, they can find stuff, put it together, and the chef can put it together, put a nice decoration on the plate, and send it out to the restaurant. So that's, I think, where we're getting to in oral history, that if we have the material mapped, if we have it in that GPS way, in these different versions, if we imagine a sous chef who's got all these things, and we're doing that, we're working with people doing that on their projects now. They've already done half the markup by identifying the themes and the stories, and then when they need a presentation, they can reach in and pull them out according to that, doing some applying the keywords, not just to the whole transcript, but to the particular thing like Martin Luther King that you're looking at there. So that's, I think, probably a good place to open this to your responses and questions. To me, I will say simply, in wrapping it up, that shared authority was written a long time ago, in 1990. So that was all early work, almost all of it based on looking at interviews, particularly Studs Terkel and some other early pioneers in oral history, and thinking about dialogue. This work now is really at the other end, but in some ways it's the same thing. And I think I'll close with this point, which appropriately comes from an oral history itself. So on the cover of my Steelworker book, which I guess we don't have here, but some of you may know it, it's called Portraits in Steel. and it's interviews with steel workers and their families after the closing of steel mills in Buffalo, and they're all combined with the work of a major documentary photographer, Milton Rogovan, who has documented workers all over the world, not in India, I don't think, but in many other places around the world. And the guy on the cover of the book is a black steel worker, pictured in front of the furnace that he's working at. Very heroic looking figure, with a bare chest and sweating and holding his tools. And in his interview, he said a lot. People often have a kind of, I'm sure you find this in work that you've done, things that when we hear them, we filter them out. People say in English, they'll say like I did, like, and we don't even hear it. I mean, it's just, there's a linguistic term, I forget what it is for that. It's just a kind of filler while the thought is forming in their mind. And it's tricky when you're transcribing how much of that to leave in, because it captures their personality. But if you have all of it there, it's unreadable. It just jumps out at you and so forth. Well, this man, his name was Joe Kemp, his go-to phrase, which he said a lot, was, you know what I'm saying? So you hear it a lot in black speech here these days. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? He said it many, many times. I couldn't put them all in, but we have a few of them in the interview. And so I originally thought of that as a problem in transcription. How much do you keep in to make it readable while also not sanitizing the actual voice of the person? Somebody once said that transcription is better thought of as an active translation. You're trying to make something work in one language, meaning the language of print, in some way that evokes its meaning in another language, which is the language of orality, of hearing. So but as we, coming back to the first point that I made in the précis for this, we're discovering that the question of listening, of dialogue, is as important in processing interviews and working with them, in working with the communities and working with the speakers, as it is in the interview itself. And Joe Kemp's question, you know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? Is the fundamental question in oral history. If you don't know what I'm saying, then why are you asking me questions? What he's really saying is, are you listening? Are you getting it? Are you receiving it? And a good interviewer in their follow-up question is always answering that question by saying, of course I heard you, and my follow-up is such and such. And that's when a conversation becomes real. Otherwise, a novice interviewer, like many of the students I've had, will cut people off, and somebody's told them that they have to go in with a list of questions. And so somebody's just starting to unroll, and the student says, my next question is, and that's the end of the real quality of the interview in that sense. So this notion of bringing into your practice a kind of active two-way listening, that they have to listen to you and you have to listen to them. And if you do that actively, you communicate, and that dialogue becomes inscribed in the interview. And that is then something that same quality of listening becomes part of what happens when somebody's working with the recordings and the transcripts and trying to say, well, what are the 5 key stories here? And let me go back to the community and see if here's my choices. Well, let's see what their choices are. And that can then be negotiated, and you end up with a dialogic construction of, let's say, an exhibit or a community presentation or something like that. So I think that's perhaps a good place to start, to stop. And I would invite any responses or questions. I don't know that much. I've had some experience in India and in Bangalore, but not too much beyond that. So I'd be really fascinated with whatever you've gotten from this. And if there are ways you would like to explore applying these approaches their story platform that we use, which is an environment that both produces the instant transcript and provides a framework for managing a lot of the indexing that we've done is done interactively on that platform. We can help you get started in that. Um, it's not it's not very expensive in terms of their access to their platform, and we're prepared to offer whatever advice we can. Most of the work we're doing now, which is really exciting as a consultant, is we're not doing it for people. We're helping put tools in their hands and doing a lot of back and forth to ease the process of working in a new mode, as opposed to just saying, here are some instructions, go follow them. So if in fact we end up with some possibilities of working dialogically, we would be delighted to explore that with any of you on your projects and your community work. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And I think by my clock, we're right on time. And I think it's open for Q&A or whatever people might like to say by way of response.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful and very inspiring lecture. We want to know how now is use AI and how to communicate with it. So now I will invite our participants to ask their question. In YouTube, you can see there are lots of questions. But for the time constraint, we will take a few. So, sir, can I take the first question? Sir?
I don't,
Hello, am I
yeah,
audible? Hello, sir, am I audible? Hello, sir.
you talking to me?
Yes, sir. Am I audible, sir?
I, I haven't gotten any questions.
No, no. I mean, I will read out those questions from YouTube,
Oh,
sir.
okay.
So, okay. So I will just the first question, and it's asked by Arnav Rokhi. He's asking that in an era where digital tools and AI-driven methods are increasingly meditating oral history practices, how do we critically assess the risk of replacing the intimacy and contextual richness of oral testimony with algorithmic interpretation? Can technological input capacities ever genuinely replicate the epistemic ethic of listening, silences, and emotion that oral history depends upon? Or do they ultimately sanitize or standardize memory into metadata?
Well, that's a really interesting question or comment. I must say, I'm not, I share a number of those concerns. And my basic approach to, we're using AI only really in two forms. One is to do the automatic transcript, and then it's a partial job that is then carried further. And also, we found that on their story platform, they have a pretty good uh, engine that produces a AI summary of the entire interview, um, and that people have found somewhat helpful, particularly if there's a vast body of material. But it only goes so far, and they also produce what they call indexes, which divides it into sections, and those are almost worthless. We're finding. So in general, I mean, my sense, and I think it's implied in the question, is that I'm interested in. I mean, AI, like anything, it's a tool, and the tool has got to be in somebody's hands. A paintbrush is a tool. You know, a scalpel is a tool. A uh, a rock is a tool if you're a caveman. You know, so the question is, what power does it give you, and what can be done with it? And I think to approach it that way constantly allows you to say, I'm interested in the tool up to this point, and at that point, that's where I can take over from there. So it's how the two work together. I'm not interested in the algorithms that are trying to figure out every aspect of interviews, particularly because the listening that, and really my last point is, and Joe Kemp's question, it's, you know what I'm saying? He's talking to you. Do you know what I'm saying? Not does AI know what I'm saying? And that requires active listening. Even if AI could do it, we're working with the students who are now on one of our major projects, is helping a project having to do with disabilities. And they've got some doctoral students who are doing a lot of this, workup of the processing these very, very demanding, complicated interviews. And even if it could do a better job, the real value is for them to learn, in having to make decisions, to make judgments. They then have to discover what's in the material, what's in those silences. I'll give you one other example, which was really interesting. It's a somewhat charged one, but we helped on a project that was involved with immigrants and with AIDS activism, and particularly with the LGBTQ community in Worcester, Massachusetts. And one of the interviews involved somebody who was in Jamaica, who was gay, and who worked in a hotel, and in some level was caught between a kind of paradise of all of these rich Americans coming down who were gay, looking for, passion, and the staff on the hospital, who were deeply homophobic, and so he was kind of in this world, and in his interview, he describes going to the restroom at one point, and the person at the stall next to him imagined that he was essentially being approached, and pulled out a knife and was about to attack him as a gay person who he thought he was just using the urinal, but in any event. And in the interview, he had a lot of places where while thoughts were forming, he would say, and many of those, when they were working up the material, were cut out because they're just filler. They had enough there to give some sense of the rhythm. But in this case, it was so clear, if you really listen, that this man who was being interviewed by a woman was deciding. He paused. He was about to say, and I was there, and and clearly he was deciding whether he could share the story, which is a fairly gross one and scary for him. And it was after that he left Jamaica and came to the U.S. So that obviously was important. Well, that kind of judgment about a vocalization which has meaning, as opposed to a vocalization which is just a kind of filler. So you'd leave some of them in there so that it has the personality and rhythm, but you don't need all of them. But you certainly need some of them like that if they seem to have. So that's the kind of thing I would not, in the slightest, be interested in AI trying to make for me. And not only because we or they or you can do a better job of it, but because the real value in working with the community is to attend to those silences, to those hesitations, to those things, and to have to think about them and to really say, what's going on here? And this one I have to leave in, or this one will help me understand what a highlight clip is, whereas the others are not consequential. So, in a sense, it's not only that there's no escaping judgment, but there is every reason to provide more opportunities for judgment. We're finding even that judgment of where do I break the paragraphs in the transcriptive record so that there's one every 2 or 3 minutes, which is the first thing people starting on this process have to do.
Thank you, sir, for the generous answer. As you all know, the AI can do some kind of work, but AI can't detect emotion in our voice or emotion in any kind of thing. So next we will take one question. It's in our chat box. Raki Mondol is asking, that drawing from Homi Bhabha's concept of the third space and Derrida's notion of deference, how do we critically integrate the moment of translation between voice and archive, between raw testimony and the structured representation? Does the oral history kitchen risk collapsing the radical in-betweenness of subaltern temporality into fixed categories of identity, chronology, and experience? Oh, I think Sir just left the meeting. Hello, sir. Sir, your mic is muted.
Um, I don't know what happened, but somehow the platform closed. And anyway, I logged back on and I'm here. So I think we're probably at our time. But again, I think I was able to say how much I appreciated this opportunity. And I would be delighted to hear. I think they have my email, and the materials are available, I think, through the Voices from the Periphery Network. And I would love to stay in contact with you all and learn more about your work. And if there's any way we can be helpful in doing some of it collaboratively or just by advice or in any form, I've certainly recall with enormous interest my connection with oral history in India previously, and have maintained some of those contacts, co-editing a series in public history with Indira Chowdhury for the Greuter Press in Europe. And we've had some stuff from India appear there. So, and I'm still in touch with both her and Venkat Srinivasan at the Biological Center in Bangalore. So in any event, I really would look forward to working with you in any way, informally or formally. Some of you may be at the, I'll be doing a number of things at the International Oral History Association, which is meeting in September. It's going to be a very large and exciting meeting in Krakow, Poland. And I'm doing a master class, which will be some of the material we've touched on here, but more. I'm involved with a fascinating panel that a friend of mine has put together, who is dealing with her own family history. This is a woman who's a journalist who's been writing about people in rural Maine for 30 years, but has, until this opportunity, never quite looked at her own family history very closely. And on one side of her family, most of them died in the Holocaust, not far from Krakow, where we'll be. And one of them survived. A woman wrote a memoir of being a child survivor between age 7 and 12. And towards the end of her life, she's still alive though, at 89, wrote a memoir. I'll just mention it. You could find it probably on online. It's called Becoming Janet. Becoming Janet. And that was the name she was given when she landed in America. Her name was Gustava in Poland. And it's a remarkable memoir of what happened then. And so my friend has put together a panel, and I'll sort of just mention this because it's really a fascinating concept, that certainly for the Holocaust, but really in many other cases, within a few years for the Holocaust, there will be no survivors left because of when it took place. So in that sense, the memory is in the hands of the second, third, and fourth generations. It's not in the hands of the people who lived it. And more broadly, the fascinating thing for oral history is how many of the stories that we carry around and that we provide in interviews, let's say, are not our direct experience. They're things we were told by our parents or by our grandparents or by somebody else. So they're what my friend calls received memory. And yet we are the bearers of a lot of memories that are not authentically ours, but are things that we were told and that become part of how we construct our social location and our identity and so forth. So dealing with this relationship of shards of memory, little bits of pieces, and what they're doing in the panel for Krakow is talking about taking little bits that many of the people, they had a Zoom meeting of members of the family in, I think, 6 different countries, most of whom had never met each other, talking about what they heard about their roots in the Holocaust and what it's meant to them over their lives and how they put things together. So it's a remarkable set of problems, and that's what they'll be dealing, and I'll be part of that panel. In any event, should you get a chance, it certainly is going to be a meeting, and I think it's the middle of September, very much worth attending. And the International Oral History Association that meets biannually or sometimes every 3rd year. This is the previous one was in Rio de Janeiro 2 summers ago. It's a very interesting organization and a place that many of your members might find, even through e-contact or Zoom meetings and so forth, a useful network to be. Much of from what I understand about the impulses and the practice involved in voices from the periphery, you will find a lot of resonance with many of the people who will be at this meeting. And again, I can keep this in mind that if you're not there, which I assume you probably won't happen that much, I can certainly keep my eye out for people who would be interested in what you're doing and vice versa, and perhaps make some of those connections for you.
Thank you, sir. So, can we just the next question, sir? Sir, am I audible? Hello, sir. Am I audible? Hello, sir. Am I audible, sir? Okay. Okay, sir. So I think then we can stop here and we will just send the other questions to you, sir. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. And thank you everybody for watching us, the lecture. So thank you once again, sir, for joining us.